Hannah Pearl Davis, also known as Pearly Things, is quite the controversial person. Given the controversial nature of her content, lots of people consider the things that she says to be toxic and unhelpful, but she personally feels that this is something that she's always known that God was calling her to do. Pearl, who sometimes identifies as Catholic, isn't the only one that believes that she's doing God's work. Lots of Christian men have turned to Pearl believing that she's giving them biblical advice, since she often uses Christian themes and teachings in order to make her point. But in keeping up with Pearl's content, I noticed that whenever she starts talking about the church or the Bible or Christian marriage, I found that she often usually misleads with half-truths, which ultimately leads to advice that makes these men far, far worse than they ever were before. For example, let's start with her advice to save your virginity for marriage. Recently, Pearl has made several tweets about how women should save themselves from marriage, which of course is an idea that we get from Christianity. So on the face of it, this may sound like biblical advice, until you hear what else she says. She regularly refers to women who have had more than one sexual partner as whores, while referring to men who have had several sexual partners as high-value men. For men, she encourages them to only marry virgins, while simultaneously encouraging them to sleep around with these quote-unquote whores.
I have 264 bodies, and I want a girl with 0 bodies. Absolutely nothing. I don't want to. Amen, brother. I'm a high-value man.
Not to mention, she also says things like, I think that God looks at women's sexual immorality as worse. He's a logical guy. However, with that being said, she also talks about how the number of sexual partners matter and provides some legitimate data in support of her claim.
Basically, the more partners a woman has, the less likely she is to have a happy marriage.
So, Pearl's advice is that women shouldn't have sex before marriage because the higher number of sexual partners that a woman has, the less likely she is to have a happy marriage. And her advice for men is to sleep around with several women before they get married to a virgin. Now, for a lot of guys, you might be hearing this thinking that following Pearl's advice might just make you the happiest man in the world, because you get to have your cake and you get to eat it too, right? Well, not right. In reality, it will only make you far more miserable than you were before, and this isn't hard to prove either. You'd find yourself far happier taking the full biblical advice on sex instead of Pearl's, even if you don't believe in the Bible. The reason why is because the biblical concept of saving sex for marriage doesn't just apply to women in the Bible, it also applies to men. And it's the full biblical teaching that's consistent with the studies that Pearl cites, which shows that the same risk that applies to women also applies to men as well. If you save sex for marriage, you're far more likely to stay married and have a much lower risk of getting a divorce. In addition, the fewer sexual partners that someone has, again, for both women and for men, the more likely that they are to report being happy in their marriage, having higher levels of mental health, and also having a far more satisfying sex life. Now, this sounds like everything that Pearl's viewers would love to have, so we would assume that she would be excited to share this information with them, right? I mean, if Pearl genuinely cares about her audience and she wants for them to be happy, then she should also tell the men to save themselves from marriage and not to sleep around with other women, because statistically speaking, that's what's objectively best for them. But even though Pearl is familiar with these studies, she sadly dismisses their validity. She says, are we really going to believe studies that say men are also unhappily married because they slept around? Sounds like studies ran by some simps. So, when presented with evidence that she's wrong and that her advice is actually harmful to the men in her audience, she seems to treat the data the same way that she appears to treat the Bible. She doesn't mind quoting it when it suits her narrative, but will hand wave away anything that goes against what her audience wants to hear. For example, one verse that Pearl has retweeted a few times is Ephesians 5:22, which says that wives should submit to their husbands. Now, as a Christian, although I appreciate Pearl appealing to the Bible, we don't hear Pearl instructing her male audience to give up their lives for their wives, to love their wives, and to not be harsh with their wives, which is also part of the context of the verse that she shares. But what she says about submission doesn't just stop there, and this leads us to the next objectively bad piece of advice that men are getting from Pearl. When someone on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, said that the church is a good starting place to find women, Pearl responded by saying that the church would be a good start if most churches were led by men and not women. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've been to more than 3 churches in your life, then you already know that most churches aren't led by women at all. In fact, just by doing a quick Google search, it shows that 87% of pastors in America are men and only 12.9% are women. So, of course, not only is she factually wrong on this, but she's also wrong in implying that the church isn't a good place for people to find a good woman to marry. Statistically speaking, practicing Christians are quite literally the happiest married couples in the world compared to other marital groups. And where are you most likely to find a practicing Christian? Well, obviously, at church. These studies once again prove that God's way will give you the highest chance of being happy, and Pearl's way will give you a higher chance of being unhappy. As we mentioned earlier, Pearl has mentioned in several videos and tweets that the churches need to tell women to submit to their husbands, but she often has a very skewed view of what biblical submission is. This was ironically brought to her attention during a Twitter debate between her and non-Christian commentators. June from the channel Shoe on Head told Pearl that she's confusing submission with abuse and being a doormat, and then Destiny jumped in saying that even in Christian conservative households, men don't demand women to submit to them, and they treat their marriage as a partnership with mutual respect for one another. And to this, Pearl responded by saying, "Actually, thank you for helping me make my point." All caps. Even the church doesn't push real traditional relationships. Now, of course, if that's what Pearl means by traditional relationships, then the church is right not to push them. When Destiny says that it's a partnership with mutual respect, he's far more biblical than Pearl on this issue. In the Bible, the man is described as the head and the wife is described as the body, which means that they're a team working together, and this is done with love and respect. Because marriage is said to unite them as one, a man is supposed to love his wife as he does his own body. That's what the Bible teaches. And although I appreciate Pearl attempting to quote the Bible and biblical teachings, she falls prey to what everyone does when they're only trying to use the Bible to support their preferred narrative or mission. They quote the Bible when they believe that it suits their narrative, but fail to give the other side of the story. And there's honestly no greater example of this than we see in what Pearl says next. Even though Pearl often uses biblical themes and language and imagery, she always does so in a way that paints women as the devil. And I don't mean this hyperbolically. I mean this literally. Pearl says things like, men naturally have God in them. There's a reason men naturally have honor, dignity, and respect. Women usually do what's best for themselves. God is in men, the devil is in women.
Little girls are the devil!
Now, obviously, that's neither biblical nor helpful. Not only are women and men both created in the image of God, but men and women both have the same proclivity to sin. And if anything, the Bible actually works against her point, since it's only men that are reported as having Satan fill their hearts, and it's only men that have the devil enter them. Now, of course, that doesn't mean anything, besides the point that Pearl just doesn't get it. But that aside, once again, if we just contrast Pearl's view of women with God's, we'll quickly realize which view is better for a man to hold. The majority of Pearl's content is crafted to appeal to bitter men who have been hurt by women and will only reinforce their bitterness. Because the only thing that they hear from Pearl is about how bad and wrong women are, this makes bitter men more bitter towards women, which obviously will only make them worse with women than they ever were before coming and watching her content. Every chance Pearl gets, she finds a way to demonize, belittle, and blame women for all of the problems in the world. And if you're listening to this message over and over, what do you think will happen to you? Do you think that you'll find yourself becoming more free from whatever negative experiences you've had with women in the past? Or will you become more bitter towards women and become more enslaved to the pain that women have caused you? I mean, really think about it. Most of her content only highlights the flaws that some women have, treating them as universal, while also highlighting things that women have done wrong in failed marriages. She never focuses on good and practical advice for how men can get into a good marriage, and doesn't show any examples of a good marriage and how to maintain a good marriage. Her advice just simply doesn't line up with reality, even though she says that it's the Christian view that doesn't line up with reality. Now, even though she says this, ironically, not only has she failed to show several examples of these red pill marriages working in the long term with both partners being happy, but we also have plenty of research showing that Christians who follow God's design for marriage are literally the happiest marriage group in the world and stay married. It's because of this, paired with the fact that Pearl isn't known to have ever had a successful relationship in the past, I think that men in particular would be better to echo her when she says,
If you can't maintain a relationship, why would I take advice from you?
So, if you want a long, lasting, and healthy relationship, objectively speaking, you'll have a far better chance in getting what you want by taking God's advice as it's laid out in the Bible. And if you want a far worse chance, then by all means, I would encourage you to take Pearl's advice. But to be fair, we should be clear that Pearl isn't all that sold on religion and the Bible, and has been really pushing away from them for what I think are some of the most bizarre reasons that I've ever heard. Go ahead and click here to see what I mean, and I'll see you over there. But the next time that you hear Pearl saying,
I'm really not going to take the church seriously until they start calling out women for not waiting till marriage.
what are you gonna say? What do you mean?